I'm Hannah Kaplan, and this is the WCS Wild Audio Podcast, where you'll find reported audio stories covering the latest news and newsmakers from the Wildlife Conservation Society's Global Conservation Program, Zoos and Aquarium, and their many partners. We've got a great show today, so let's get to it.
Every 4 years, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, brings together governments, NGOs, scientists, and Indigenous leaders at the World Conservation Congress. This October, it will be convened in Abu Dhabi. The growing threat of the pet trade in terrestrial wildlife is one of the most important issues that will be addressed. WCS Wild Audio's Dan Rosen has more.
We know that the pet trade in terrestrial wildlife is global and vast. But because most countries don't keep comprehensive records of the species imported as pets, it's difficult to quantify just how big.
But we do know from what we've seen from markets and from observations of seized animals that the scale is absolutely huge.
This is Elizabeth Bennett, WCS Vice President for Species Conservation.
It encompasses a vast numbers of species and of all different taxa, if we're talking mammals or reptiles or birds and amphibians. So it covers a huge array of taxa right through to tarantulas. And it also has an enormous number of individual animals as well, on a scale that most people just don't contemplate.
In fact, the pet trade is a huge threat to the conservation of many species around the world.
So, for example, chameleons, a lot of people like them in the pet trade because they're very pretty and they're interesting looking animals. And so over a 9-year period, more than 1 million live chameleons were reported as being exported globally of 108 different species. So that gives you some idea of scale. For cheetahs, which is one that, they're traded for pets mainly in the Middle East, where they're seen as prestige symbols. Over a 9-year period, 3,600 live cheetahs, mostly cubs, which means they probably killed the mother, were estimated to be traded, mainly coming from the Horn of Africa, where they're pretty rare, destined for wealthy countries in the Middle East.
And there are other issues that arise from this trade. One is the danger posed by invasive species. Animals either escape from the pet trade or they become problems as pets and people let them go. They can then become a threat to native species.
And the other one is clear risks to human health, because some of these animals carry diseases which we can potentially catch, and also to animal health. So if they're introduced into the wild because they escape, then they can risk local populations. And potentially, if they're carrying things like little snails, something like that, it can also threaten agricultural health.
WCS works on the front lines to tackle this trade, supporting stronger laws, enforcement, and education campaigns worldwide to reduce demand.
WCS is already doing a huge amount to address the issue all across the board. From our field programs, where we're working on enforcement programs to protect species within the protected areas especially, and working with local communities around those protected areas so they to reduce their incentives for poaching those animals and make sure that they have other sources of livelihood. So working with the local communities. Then we're working along the trade chain to enforce laws along trade chains and in markets where the species are illegal, and right through to the zoos and aquariums, where we are very involved in helping government enforcement agencies deal with confiscated animals.
At the upcoming IUCN World Conservation Congress, WCS is co-sponsoring a motion to address the trade head-on. Liz says it's a critical step.
The motion at IUCN is basically asking IUCN to set up a task force of experts to draw up IUCN guidelines for how the pet trade should be managed. Now, IUCN guidelines are not legally binding, but they're hugely influential.
The motion calls on governments, NGOs, and communities to collaborate on reducing demand, curbing illegal trade, and ensuring stronger safeguards for species at risk. If adopted, it would signal a global commitment to tackling one of the most under-recognized drivers of biodiversity loss.
One of the things we're trying to do is make sure those guidelines are really strong, given the scale of the problem. So we're proposing that the guidelines might look into excluding certain taxa from being traded altogether. So primates and big cats should never be pets. They're just not good pets, and they are very vulnerable to overexploitation from the wild. The other thing that we're proposing, which is much more controversial and which will be debated a lot within IUCN, is we're proposing that at least they think about making a positive list of species which can be traded rather than a negative list of things that can't be traded. Because with a negative list, you're always rushing behind the curve because things can change very rapidly. Suddenly an animal becomes fashionable. And so by the time regulations can come in, it's almost too late.
With motions like this, Liz says, there are bound to be compromises made at the Congress in Abu Dhabi. But WCS will be there advocating for strong action to address this massive issue. For WCS Wild Audio, I'm Dan Rosen.
Today's episode was produced and reported by Dan Rosen, with help from Hannah Kaplan and Nat Moss. The WCS Wild Audio podcast is a production of the Wildlife Conservation Society. Stay tuned for our next episode, and don't forget to follow, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts.